In this tutorial I'm going to show you how I would go about drawing and painting a film star from scratch using Photoshop. So first off, you're going to need photographic reference. So I've gone for Daniel Craig from Quantum of Solace as James Bond. Now when it comes to image size, I choose to go for quite a large image size, and the reason is that when it comes to painting in the eyes later on, if you choose to have a fairly low canvas size, then you won't have very many pixels to paint the eyeballs, and this can get quite frustrating. So if you go image size, I go for around 3,000 to 4,000 pixels on the width and height. It does mean that the file size is going to be fairly big, so if you have a slow computer then you might want to go for a lower width and height, but if you have a fast computer then try and go for a large one because it will help you out later on. The next thing we need to do is set up our grid, because we're going to start drawing this, but I want to draw it from scratch. I don't want to trace over this photograph. So if you go onto your keyboard and go Control Internet at symbol to bring up your grid, and you can toggle this on and off. So now what we need to do is choose the size and placement of our grid. So if you go Edit, Preferences, and this has gone off screen, but Guides, Grids and Slices, so we're in our Preferences window, we go Grids, Guides and Slices. Now our grid here, I've chosen to go for a red. I think the default is grey or black, but I've gone for red to make it nice and easy to see. Here we've got grid line every 20 centimeters. So if I change this to say 10, we get more grid. If we go for 20, then it sort of seems a bit of an easier grid to look at. What the general idea is that using this grid we can break up the image into lots of small images. So if I go onto, say, this canvas here and bring up my grid, the grid matches exactly that of the original photograph. So I then go 4 squares in, and that's the start of his top of his head. I then go onto this one, 4 squares in, and that's the top of his head. And I know that to be true because it is on this one. Now what you can do to make it a little bit easier, and this is what I find easier, is I write numbers on the squares, just because as you're glancing over it's easier just to see the reference. So I can easily go 4, 4, and there's the top of his head, 5, 5, and it comes over like this, 6 goes along like so, 7 it's sort of nearly enough halfway, so that's kind of like that, and then it comes down. And basically the idea is that you just keep on going, and I'm just roughly putting it in. I'm not going into super detail here. I'm just roughing this out so that we get the general look of what Daniel Craig will look like in my painting. If you're finding that your grid is doing this and it's really annoying because it's sticking to the grid, what you may want to do is, if you go View, go Snap to, and untick Grid. And now you can draw nicely without it sticking on the grid. Okay, so there's my sketch of Daniel Craig. It's fairly rough, as you can tell, but it's generally, the eyes are in the right place, nose is in the right place, that kind of thing. I've also started trying to just roughly sketch in where the shadows start and end, as this can be useful later on when we start to block in the colours. It's just useful to have that kind of information there, so it's quick and easy to just go, okay, well, this is the shadow part, this is the light part, that kind of thing. So the next stage is to start blocking in the colours and start shading. So what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in our drawing's face. We're going to make a new layer and we're going to call it shade, and we're going to put that underneath our lines. I'm going to zoom in on our reference material here. So for our brush, we're going to get a soft brush. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start blocking in the colour of Daniel Craig's face. So if we zoom in on his eye, let's start there. So we're going to zoom in on the reference material as well. So I'm going to use a hard-edged brush, opacity 100, flow 100. So at the moment all I'm going to be doing is blocking in the general colour. So we're not actually shading right now, all we're doing is just blocking this in to get the colour generally right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start putting in the colour of surrounding the eye, eyebrow and the nose. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to hold down Alt on the keyboard. I'm going to sample a colour, so underneath this eyelid here. And then I'm going to start painting in that colour there. Now I'm only blocking in, I'm not trying to do any sort of shading particularly, I'm just blocking in the colours so that when it does come for shading, we'll have all the right colours in place. So it would be a simple case of just mixing those colours together, which should be a fairly fast process once we have these colours in place. So what I'm going to do now is start to blend in the colours that we've put down around the eyes, nose and the cheek area. So I'm going to zoom in on the eye, get that looking good, and then work my way out. Now the way to do it is if you make a new layer, and we'll call it blend, we'll zoom in on the eye. Now what you want to do is you want to get a soft brush like this one, set your opacity down to around 50, float around 50, and if you've got CS5 then you can click these buttons as well and they help blend in the paint. And then we'll go into the eye area and we're just going to start blending in these colours. Now the way I'm doing it is I am selecting or sampling with pressing the Alt key down on the keyboard to bring up the eyedropper tool, sample the colour, and then you can start painting it. The colour that you actually get out of the paintbrush is going to be lighter than the one that you've sampled, and the reason is because you've got your opacity and your flow down and it's a soft brush. Now if I wanted that colour I can just keep going over this paint and pressing hard on my Wacom tablet and I can get that same colour. But the good thing is that I can sample, say, this dark brown and then start working it in to this colour. But what we're doing is we're creating different shades here. So I can then go over and sample that colour again, and you can quickly build up several shades which give you a good selection, a good range selection of shades which look good once you've finished it. What we're going to do now is we're going to make a new layer and call it Iris, and we're going to start putting in the colour of the iris on the eye. If we make a new layer and call it Pupil, if we start off by getting the black colour in our brush, and we're going to just paint on a black pupil on the eye. Go back to your iris layer, choose a colour from in the eye. All you're going to start doing is make some thin strokes, and this might be a little bit hard for you to see at the moment, but thin strokes coming out of the pupil to the edge of the iris. I want to make these blue eyes, so I'm going to go with dark and light blue, and you just need to keep building up these really thin strokes on the eyes. Now this is where having a good sized image to start with is beneficial, because if your image is too low resolution, then you might find that you don't have enough room on your canvas to actually detail this eye properly, and it can be quite frustrating. Okay, so now that we've done our iris, we're going to bring it to life a little bit. So if you go make a new layer and call it Dodge, and set the blend mode up here to Color Dodge. So now you want to get a colour, a light blue colour, or the colour of your eyes, but make it a lighter colour. So I'm going to go for around about here. Just very gently start putting in the highlights of your eye down the bottom somewhere. Now if you get a darker colour, make a new layer, set this one to Colour Burn, and call it Burn, and then change your opacity down and your flow down a bit. This is quite a strong thing, so you don't want too much burn, but what you can do is you can start picking out dark edges within the eye, and it just gives it a slightly more depth. I'm going to go back onto the Dodge, do a little bit more around there. And then a little bit of shadow coming out of the pupil to give it a little bit more depth. I'm going to turn my burn layer down slightly, I think. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this eye into its own group, just to keep it organised really. And then I'm also going to create a highlight layer. Now you choose white, set your opacity and flow all the way up, and now we're going to put in the highlights. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make just a base layer of colour underneath my painting. This will just help fill out some of the gaps that I'm creating as I go along. So now I've completed the skin tones, including the shadows and highlights. Later on I'm going to go over the skin with a special skin brush to bring out the pores and details, like the little bits of hair that's down here and some of the pores that you can see in the highlights. So I'll go around there, so I'll show you how to do that later on. I thought what I would do is just mention that the brush that I've been using is a soft brush. Now you might know of Grand Theft Auto, which is a game for the PlayStation and Xbox 360, and the way that they do their artwork is very much the same as the way I'm using Photoshop to create these images. I think the main difference between the two is I reckon that they use a hard-edged brush, still with the opacity down to around about 40 or 50%, and I reckon keep these on as well. But if you use a hard-edged brush, if you look at the painting here, it's a bit of a low quality image, but you can see their brush strokes almost. It isn't as blended as this is. So if you're looking to create a Grand Theft Auto style image, then you can use the same techniques that I've shown you here, but just use your hard edge brush instead of the soft edge brush, and you should be able to get an image that looks fairly similar. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start blocking in the hair. Now the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to make a new group. I'm going to call it hair. I'm going to make a new layer and call it base hair. I'm going to put down a base colour below the hair, and then on top of that I'm going to start painting in the strokes of hair using a very thin brush. It's a bit labour intensive, it's going to take a while, but using this technique you do get a better look of hair. So I'm going to turn my opacity and flow up and just start blocking in the hair like this. So at the moment it's just one shade, and we'll do the same as we did for the face, so we'll block in the shadows and highlights. Then put in the individual strokes of the hairs, and then after we've done that we'll create a dodge layer and a burn layer with the blend mode set to dodge and the blend mode set to burn, and then using those we'll go over the hair and we can create highlights and dark shadowy areas which will help define the hair a little bit better. Okay, so that's our base. Now we're going to create a layer, just call it hairs, and we're going to start painting on the various hairs. Change back to a soft brush and put the opacity down to around about 75, flow to about 55. So the way to do hairs is you want to look at the general direction on your reference photo of where the hair's going, so along or down or up, and then simply paint in that direction. So at the moment I'm going to do it with a light colour as it stands out. I'm just looking at where the hairs are flowing and then just starting to paint them on. This is going to take a while. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer and call it burn, and we're going to set the blend mode up here to colour burn. I'm going to get a dark colour. I'm going to go for this brown. I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger. I'm going to set the opacity down a little bit, and all I'm going to do is start going over where I want the shadows to be, and this just creates depth within the hair a lot quicker than if we just paint alone. So can be quite a useful tool to use to create the shadows that we need within our hairs. Once you've done that, make a new layer and call it dodge. And then set the blend mode to colour dodge. Choose a lighter colour, so we're going to go with one of the highlight colours I think, and then start going over where you want the highlights to be in the hair. So now we're going to do the eyebrows. This is done in very much the same way as we've done their hair. All you've got to remember is that the eyebrows generally go in the same direction. So if we zoom in on the eyebrows here, you do get some hairs going out towards the edges near the nose, but generally they all flow in the same direction. So if you get a small brush, so I'm going to go with size 6, I've made a new layer in a new group called eyebrows, and generally it's just a case of painting thin strokes on. You want to change your colours a couple of times, so have a bright one, have a darker one, and then once you're done, create two new layers, one set to blend mode of colour dodge and the other layer set to a blend mode of colour burn, and just go over them lightly, and this will give it a bit more depth. So now I'm going to start on the jacket. It's a similar process to the way I did the face. So we're going to make a new layer and call it base jacket, and we're just going to sample a colour from the reference picture, and it's a simple case of blocking in the main colours. So I'm just going to put down a large base colour, and then on top of that we'll put the different shading. Okay, so to do some of the detail on the jacket, what I'm going to do is make a new brush. So I'm going to use this image here, which is, I've just put into Google sandstone, clicked on large images, and this one has come up. So what I'm going to do is make this into a brush. So the first thing I'm going to do is go Image, Adjustments, Threshold. Now as you see, it creates a black and white image, and what you can do is you move this around a bit. So I'm going to go around about there, click OK. I'm going to make a new layer above it. I'm going to go to my gradient tool here. Now in this, you want to have one end as black, the other end as black, but on this top box here, this white one, set the opacity to 0, which means that you create a nice gradient that goes into being transparent. So click OK on that. Up the top here, we've got various different ways that we can have a gradient. Now we want the second one in, which will basically, what we want to do is create a nice soft black gradient that goes into a transparent area, so our brush will be nice and soft. So what we're going to do is we're going to go from the centre to one of the outside corners. So we create a nice soft brush like this. Now with the top layer and this layer, if you do Control E on the keyboard, it all goes into one layer. Now do Control I on the keyboard. That inverts your selection. Now if we go to Edit, Define Brush Preset, call it something like sandstone, and now we can just put that to the side. Now in here we're going to create a new layer and call it sandstone. Select your brush, and now our new brush is down the bottom here. So all we need to do now is select a colour and start painting it onto the background. Now what you'll notice here is that you get this nice sort of rough texture, which is the kind of texture that I want to have for this particular jacket. And you're using all the background colours that you've previously put on, and you're just creating the textures that you would like to see in your jacket. Another thing I'm going to do with this brush is set the spacing a little bit further apart, so that we don't get a continual brush effect, you get more of a pattern coming on. So set your spacing down a little bit, and you might want to play with that a touch. So one of the final things that we're going to do on this painting is to do the skin detail, which we're going to try and do quite similar to how we've created the detail on the jacket. Now I'm going to use a set of brushes by a guy called David Nagel. I'm going to use Nagel Series 37 brushes. Now these are available on the internet for free. Just put me into Google, Nagel Series 37 brushes, and you can find a download link from there. What I'm going to try and show you is how I go about using these brushes. Now this collection has some nice different variations in the skin. So my favourite being 15 and 17 of these, but try them all out and see what you think. The general rule with doing skin detail is you block in where your highlights and shadows are, and then say we've got a highlight going down here. Well, if we take a darker colour, this darker pink, and then loosely go over that, then get a bright white and go over it again, and what you'll see is that you start getting these skin pores where the light is hitting the pores in the skin. If you build these up across the various parts of your face, you can get quite a nice effect. But all you should know is that with the lighter areas, put a little bit of dark on, then layer back on the light. Another thing you can do is, if you've created a bit of skin detail, if you set it to overlay, then you can get quite nice effects. In fact, go down the blend modes and you might be able to find something which suits your particular need. So the last thing that we're going to do is to create a background for the picture. Now all I'm going to do is to create a nice gradient of blue sky with a couple of clouds in the background. So what I'm going to do is go to my gradient tool over here, click up the top to bring up my gradient editor, and I'm going to choose the blue colour that I want for my background, and then the light one in the corner, like so. Then I'm going to choose the middle gradient, which is a radial gradient, and I'm just going to simply drag it so that we have a nice sort of light coming from this side. Then I'm going to create another layer above it. I'm going to choose a brush, which will be my cloud brush. Choose a grey colour for the clouds, and I'm just going to quickly paint those in. And there we have it, our finished piece of Daniel Craig. So now that we've come to the end of the tutorial, I hope that you found it useful, and hopefully that you've learned a couple of new techniques that you can use in your own paintings. If you'd like to see more paintings or more tutorials, then you can go to our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/wearedesign. On this page we release brand new video tutorials, our photos that we post up, and also designs. So go ahead and click like on there, and come back next time. I'm Liam Jackson of We Are Design.